The stagecoach wheels kicked up dust devils along the rutted trail into Williams, Arizona, and Margaret Louise pressed her gloved hand against the window as she caught her first glimpse of the town that would be her prison for the next 3 months, watching the handful of weathered buildings shimmer in the brutal June heat of 1883. Her father's voice still echoed in her mind from their argument in Boston 2 weeks prior, his face red with frustration as he'd slammed his fist on the mahogany desk. "You think you understand hardship, Margaret? You think your charity work in the city gives you any notion of what real Americans endure? Fine. Go west. Prove you can last even 1 month in a frontier town, and I'll consider your proposal to expand our railroad holdings into social programs." He'd leaned back in his leather chair, confidence oozing from every pore. "But when you come crawling back within 30 days, begging for your comfortable life, you'll marry Richard Hartford and forget this ridiculous notion of independence." Margaret had accepted his challenge without hesitation, though she'd seen the gleam in his eye that told her he'd already won in his mind. She was 22 years old, educated at the finest schools, fluent in 3 languages, and utterly determined to prove that she was more than just a pretty face to be bartered off to the highest bidder. Richard Hartford was 45, boring, and only interested in her father's money. She'd rather die than spend her life as his ornament. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside a building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Williams General Store and Post Office." Margaret gathered her skirts and stepped down onto the dusty street, immediately feeling the eyes of every person in town turn toward her. Her silk traveling dress, despite being one of her simpler outfits, was clearly far too fine for this place. The deep green fabric already showed traces of dust, and she could feel sweat beginning to form beneath her corset. "Well, would you look at that?" a voice drawled from the porch of the general store. "Boston sent us a princess." Margaret turned to see 3 men lounging in the shade, each wearing worn denim pants and dusty shirts. The one who'd spoken was middle-aged with a tobacco-stained beard. His companion snickered. "How long you reckon she'll last, Pete?" one of them asked. "Week. I give her 3 days before she's crying for the next stage east," Pete replied. "Look at those hands. Never done a day's work in her life." Margaret lifted her chin and met Pete's gaze directly. "I'm looking for Mrs. Sarah Chen. I was told she runs a boarding house here." "Chen's place is 2 buildings down," Pete said, jerking his thumb to the left. "But I wouldn't bother unpacking. Stage comes through again in 5 days." She ignored him and retrieved her trunk from the back of the coach, surprised by its weight. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes, started to help her, but she waved him off. If she was going to prove herself capable, she needed to start now. She dragged the trunk through the dust, her arms straining with the effort, sweat now pouring down her back in the oppressive heat. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure that had once been painted white, but now showed more gray wood than paint. A small garden somehow flourished beside it, green shoots defying the arid landscape. Margaret knocked on the door and waited. The woman who answered was in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her dress was simple cotton, and her face bore the lines of someone who'd lived through hardship and come out stronger. "You must be Miss Louise," she said, her accent carrying hints of both Chinese and Western inflections. "Your telegram said you needed a room for 3 months." "Yes, madam, though apparently the town thinks I won't last 3 days." Sarah Chen's lips twitched with something that might have been amusement. "The town likes to think a lot of things. Come in before you melt. This heat isn't forgiving to newcomers." The interior of the boarding house was surprisingly cool and immaculately clean. Simple furniture filled the front room, and the smell of something savory cooking wafted from the kitchen. Sarah led Margaret upstairs to a small room with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. "Rent is $15 a month, includes 2 meals a day," Sarah said. "There's a pump out back for washing. Outhouse is behind the garden. Saturday nights I heat water for baths, but you'll need to help carry the water if you want one." "That's perfectly acceptable," Margaret said, setting her reticule on the bed. "Mrs. Chen, I need to find work. My father sent me here with minimal funds as part of his challenge. I need to support myself." Sarah studied her for a long moment. "What can you do?" "I can read and write in English, French, and Italian. I'm excellent with numbers. I've managed household accounts for years. I can sew, though I'll admit my experience is more with embroidery than practical mending. I can cook, somewhat, though my experience is limited. I'm willing to learn whatever is necessary." "The school teacher position is filled," Sarah said slowly. "And most folks here can't afford fancy embroidery. But let me ask around. Williams isn't a large town, but we have our needs. In the meantime, you can help me around the boarding house in exchange for reduced rent. That'll stretch your money further." "Thank you," Margaret said, genuinely grateful. "I truly appreciate your kindness." "Don't thank me yet. Folks here aren't mean, but they're suspicious of outsiders, especially rich ones who look like they've never missed a meal. You'll need to prove yourself, and it won't be easy." Sarah left her to unpack, and Margaret sat on the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. Through the window, she could see the dusty street, a few horses tied to hitching posts, and buildings that looked like a strong wind might knock them over. This was nothing like Boston, nothing like any place she'd ever been. For the first time since accepting her father's challenge, doubt crept into her mind. But she'd made her choice, and Margaret Louise had never backed down from anything in her life. She changed into her simplest dress, a light blue cotton that was still far too fine for Williams, but at least less ostentatious than the silk traveling outfit. When she came downstairs, Sarah was in the kitchen, stirring a large pot over a wood-burning stove that made the already warm room feel like an oven. "How can I help?" Margaret asked. Sarah gestured to a pile of potatoes. "Those need peeling. There's a knife and a bowl on the table." Margaret had watched the kitchen maids do this task hundreds of times, but had never actually done it herself. She picked up the knife and began carefully cutting away the skin, producing thick peels that wasted nearly half the potato. "Like this," Sarah said, taking the knife and demonstrating a technique that produced paper-thin peels. "Food is too precious out here to waste." Margaret tried again, doing better this time. Her hands moved slowly, unpracticed, but she focused on the task with determination. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the bubbling pot and the knife against potato skin. "Why are you really here?" Sarah finally asked. "Rich girls don't come to places like Williams without a reason." Margaret told her the truth about the bet with her father, about her desire to do something meaningful with her life, instead of becoming another wealthy man's trophy. Sarah listened without interrupting, her hands never stopping their efficient work. "Your father sounds like a fool," Sarah said when Margaret finished, "but at least he raised a daughter with spine. You'll need it. This town already has money riding on when you'll leave." "What do you mean?" "Pete Tompkins started a betting pool about an hour ago. Most money is on you leaving within a week. A few optimists think you might last 2 weeks. Nobody bet on you staying the full month, much less 3. Margaret's hands stilled on the potato she was peeling. "They're betting on my failure. They're betting on what they know. City folk come through sometimes, looking for adventure or trying to escape something. They never last. The land is hard, the work is harder, and most people who weren't born to it can't adapt. Sarah met her eyes. But I've lived in this town for 23 years, ever since my husband brought me here from San Francisco. I've seen all types come and go, and something tells me you might be different. Why? Because you're here peeling potatoes instead of crying in your room. That's a start. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of roosters and the sun already blazing through her window. Her body ached from the previous day's work. She'd helped Sarah cook, clean, wash dishes, and haul water until well past dark. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of privilege, had developed 2 small blisters. She dressed and went downstairs to find Sarah already in the kitchen. 3 men sat at the large dining table, boarding house residents who worked at the nearby lumber mill. They stared at Margaret as she entered, their conversation dying mid-sentence. "Morning," Margaret said, determined to be pleasant. "I'm Margaret Louise." The men nodded but didn't introduce themselves, turning back to their breakfast with uncomfortable silence. Margaret helped Sarah bring out plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, noting how the men's eyes followed her every move with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. After breakfast, as Margaret washed dishes, Sarah mentioned that she'd spoken to a few people about work. The general store might need help with inventory and bookkeeping. Thomas Brennan, who runs it, is getting older and his eyes aren't what they used to be, but he's stubborn. You'll need to convince him. Margaret dried her hands and walked down to the general store, ignoring the stares from people on the street. The interior was dim and cluttered, with goods stacked haphazardly on shelves that reached to the ceiling. A man in his 60s stood behind the counter, squinting at a ledger. "Mr. Brennan, my name is Margaret Louise. Mrs. Chen suggested I speak with you about helping with your bookkeeping." Thomas Brennan looked up, his eyes running over her expensive dress and styled hair. "Don't need help. Your inventory system appears to be chronological rather than categorical," Margaret said, glancing at the shelves. "And if I'm reading your ledger correctly from here, which I admit I might not be, you've recorded the same transaction twice in the past week." His face reddened. "Now you listen here, Miss High and Mighty. I'm not trying to insult you, sir. I'm trying to offer assistance. Your eyes are bothering you, clearly. You're squinting at the ledger, and you've got it positioned to catch the light from the window, which helps but isn't sufficient. I have excellent eyesight and significant experience with bookkeeping. I'll work for 50 cents a day, which I believe is below the standard rate, and I'll reorganize your inventory system at no additional charge." Thomas stared at her for a long moment. "You'll work for 50 cents a day. Why so cheap?" "Because I need to prove myself, and I understand that you're taking a risk on someone untested. If after 1 week you're unsatisfied with my work, you can dismiss me with no hard feelings." He chewed on that for a moment, then grudgingly gestured to the ledger. "Fine. 1 week. But you organize things my way, understand? This is my store. Of course, sir. I wouldn't dream of overstepping." Margaret spent the rest of the day poring over the ledger, which was indeed a mess. Thomas had been running the store for 30 years and had his own system that made sense to him, but would be incomprehensible to anyone else. She worked methodically, asking him questions when necessary, slowly building a clearer picture of the store's inventory and finances. As she worked, customers came and went, and she could hear them whispering about her. The betting pool was apparently common knowledge now, with odds being updated regularly. The general consensus seemed to be that she'd last exactly 1 week before running back east with her tail between her legs. Late in the afternoon, the door opened and a man walked in who immediately drew Margaret's attention. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that needed cutting. He wore the same denim and worn cotton as every other man in town, but there was something different about the way he carried himself. Confidence without arrogance. Strength without swagger. "Afternoon, Thomas," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the small store. "I need 20 feet of rope, a new bridle, and salt if you have it." "Got everything but the bridle, Gideon," Thomas replied. "Should have more in next week." The man, Gideon, nodded, and then his eyes found Margaret. She met his gaze, noting that his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green. He didn't stare like the other men in town had been doing. Instead, he gave her a single appraising look and then turned his attention back to Thomas. "Heard you hired the Boston lady," Gideon said. "Didn't think you were the betting type, Thomas." "I'm not betting on anything," Thomas said defensively. "I need help with the books, and she offered at a fair price." "Uh-huh." Gideon's tone suggested he didn't quite believe that. "What's the pool up to now? Last I heard, $300, most of it on her leaving within 10 days. "That right?" For the first time, Gideon looked back at Margaret, and she thought she saw something that might have been interest flicker in those unusual eyes. "Seems like a lot of money to bet against someone you don't even know." "You thinking of placing a bet, Gideon?" Thomas asked. "I don't bet on people's misery," Gideon said quietly. He paid for his supplies and left without another word. "Who was that?" Margaret asked when the door closed behind him. "Gideon Vance. Got a ranch about 5 miles north of town. Runs cattle, keeps to himself mostly. Good man, honest, pays his debts. His father started the ranch 30 years ago, and Gideon took it over when his pa died 6 years back." Thomas squinted at her. "Why, you interested?" "Just curious," Margaret said, returning to the ledger, though she found her mind wandering back to those gray-green eyes and the quiet strength in Gideon Vance's voice. She worked until the store closed at sundown, her back aching from hunching over the ledger. Thomas grudgingly admitted that she'd done good work and told her to come back tomorrow. Margaret walked back to the boarding house as the temperature finally started to drop, her body exhausted but her spirits lifted. She'd made it through one full day, only 89 more to go. Over the next week, Margaret fell into a routine. She woke before dawn, helped Sarah with breakfast, worked at the general store until closing, then returned to help with dinner and evening chores. Her hands grew calluses. Her fair skin, despite her best efforts to stay covered, began to freckle from the intense sun. Her muscles, unused to physical labor, ached constantly. The town continued to watch her with skeptical eyes. The betting pool grew larger, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, a few people began to thaw. Thomas stopped grumbling about her presence. The postmaster, an ancient man named Herbert, started tipping his hat when she walked by. One of the mill workers who boarded with Sarah actually introduced himself as Frank and asked how she was settling in. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Gideon Vance came to the general store twice more that week. Each time, he was polite but distant, conducting his business efficiently and leaving without unnecessary conversation. But Margaret noticed that he always seemed to arrive when the store was busy, when other men were around making crude jokes about the betting pool or speculating loudly about how soft her hands must be. Gideon never participated in these conversations, but his presence seemed to make the other men uncomfortable enough that they toned down their commentary. On Saturday evening, exactly 1 week after her arrival, Margaret was helping Sarah heat water for baths when someone knocked on the boarding house door. Sarah answered it and returned with a frown. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's important." Margaret dried her hands and went to the door, surprised to find Gideon Vance standing on the porch, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Vance, is something wrong?" "Might be," he said. "Can you come with me for a minute? There's something you should see." Curious and slightly apprehensive, Margaret followed him down the street. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. Gideon led her to the saloon, which she'd been carefully avoiding all week. The sound of male laughter and clinking glasses poured from the open door. "I don't think I should go in there," Margaret said. "You don't need to. Just listen for a minute." They stood outside the saloon and Margaret could hear the voices clearly. Pete Tompkins was holding court, his voice loud with alcohol. "I'm telling you, she won't make it past Sunday. She's already looking worn out. Did you see her hands yesterday, getting all rough and red? She'll realize this isn't worth it and take the next stage east. I got $50 says she's gone by Monday. I got 20 that says she makes it to Wednesday," another voice chimed in. "She's stubborn, I'll give her that." "Stubborn don't mean nothing when you're not built for this life," Pete replied. "She's a hothouse flower, pretty to look at but can't survive the real weather." Margaret felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. Hearing about the betting pool was one thing. Hearing these men discuss her like she was a horse race was another entirely. "Why did you want me to hear this?" she asked Gideon quietly. "Because you should know what you're up against," he said. "They're not going to make this easy for you. Some of them don't want you to succeed because they've got money riding on your failure. Others don't want you to succeed because it would challenge everything they believe about city folk and women who think they can make it on their own. And what about you, Mr. Vance? What do you want?" He looked at her, and in the fading light, his expression was difficult to read. "I want you to know that not everyone in Williams is betting against you, and I want you to know what you're dealing with so you can decide if it's worth it." "It's worth it," Margaret said without hesitation. "Thank you for showing me this, but it doesn't change anything. I'm not leaving." Something flickered in his eyes, respect maybe, or approval. "Good. You'll need supplies if you're planning to stick it out. The work you're doing with Thomas is fine, but you'll need more income if you want to make it 3 months. I've got a proposition for you if you're interested." "I'm listening." "My ranch is doing well enough, but I'm behind on my bookkeeping. Got 2 years' worth of receipts and records that need organizing. I also need someone who can help me write letters to potential buyers back east. I'm not much good with fancy words, and I think I'm losing sales because of it. I can pay you $1 a day, 3 days a week. You'd ride out to the ranch in the morning, work until late afternoon, then ride back to town." "That's generous, Mr. Vance. Why are you offering this?" "Because I actually need the help, and because I figure if the town's going to bet on whether you'll succeed or fail, someone ought to give you a fair chance at succeeding." He paused. "And because I don't like bullies, and that's what this betting pool has turned into. Bullying." Margaret considered the offer. $1 a day was twice what Thomas was paying her. 3 days a week would give her enough income to not just survive, but to prove to her father that she could thrive. But it would also mean spending significant time alone with a man she barely knew, which could damage her reputation, such as it was in Williams. Then again, her reputation in this town currently consisted of being the subject of a betting pool. What did she have to lose? "I accept your offer, Mr. Vance. When should I start?" "Monday. Come to the ranch at dawn. Do you ride?" "I do, though I'll need to arrange for a horse." "I'll bring an extra horse to town Monday morning. Meet me here at the boarding house." They walked back together in comfortable silence. When they reached Sarah's door, Gideon put his hat back on and nodded to her. "One more thing, Miss Louise. Don't let what those men in the saloon said get to you. They're scared. Scared of what? Of being wrong. Of discovering that the world is bigger and more complicated than they thought. Of change." He tipped his hat. "Good night, Miss Louise. Good night, Mr. Vance, and thank you." Margaret watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. For the first time since arriving in Williams, she felt something other than grim determination. She felt hope. Sunday was Margaret's first day without work since arriving, and she spent it helping Sarah tend the garden and learning how to properly wash clothes in the large tub behind the boarding house. The physical labor was exhausting, but there was something satisfying about seeing clean clothes hanging on the line, about watching the garden flourish under Sarah's patient instruction. In the late afternoon, Sarah suggested they walk to the small church on the edge of town for evening services. Margaret had been avoiding the church, knowing that she'd face the entire town's scrutiny in one place, but Sarah insisted. "You can't hide from them forever," Sarah said. "And Reverend Matthews is a good man. He doesn't hold with gambling or cruelty." The church was a simple wooden building with plain benches, and no decoration except for a cross on the wall. About 40 people were gathered when Margaret and Sarah arrived, and the conversation died the moment they walked in. Margaret kept her head high and took a seat near the back, feeling dozens of eyes on her. Reverend Matthews was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle voice. His sermon was about perseverance and faith, about trusting in God's plan even when the path seemed impossible. Margaret wondered if he'd chosen this topic specifically for her benefit. After the service, most people filed out quickly, but a few women approached Margaret. They introduced themselves as Beth, Caroline, and Susan, and they were among the few people in town who'd been cordial to her. "We wanted to invite you to our quilting circle," Beth said. She was about Margaret's age with red hair and freckles. "We meet Thursday evenings at my house. It's not fancy, but we'd be glad to have you." "That's very kind," Margaret said, surprised and touched. "I'd like that." "Don't mind the men and their bedding," Caroline added. She was older, maybe 40, with graying blonde hair. "They've got nothing better to do than make trouble. Most of us women think it's shameful how they're treating you." "Though I'll admit," Susan said with a small smile, "some of us are curious what makes a Boston lady want to come to a place like Williams." Margaret gave them the abbreviated version of her story, leaving out some of the more personal details about her father's manipulations and her determination to avoid marriage to Richard Hartford. The women listened with interest and sympathy. "Good for you," Beth said firmly. "My father tried to marry me off to a rancher twice my age when I was 17. I ran away and worked as a seamstress until I could afford my own place. Best decision I ever made." They talked for a while longer, and Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. These women understood, at least partially, what she was trying to do. They weren't betting on her failure. They were quietly hoping for her success. Monday morning arrived with the first hints of cooler weather. Margaret dressed in her most practical clothing, which still felt impractical for ranch work, and met Gideon outside the boarding house at dawn. He'd brought 2 horses, a large bay gelding for himself and a smaller chestnut mare for her. "This is Rosie," he said, handing Margaret the reins. "She's gentle but spirited. She'll treat you right if you treat her right." Margaret mounted smoothly, grateful for the riding lessons she'd taken as a child, though those lessons had been in proper English saddles with an instructor watching her every move. This Western saddle was different, more practical but less familiar. They rode out of town as the sun crept over the horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and pink. The air was still cool, a relief from the oppressive afternoon heat. Margaret breathed deeply, surprised by how much she enjoyed the open space, the endless sky, the sense of possibility. "It's beautiful," she said. Gideon glanced at her as if surprised by the comment. "Most city folk find it barren." "It is barren, but that doesn't mean it isn't beautiful. There's an honesty to it. Nothing hidden, nothing pretending to be what it isn't." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the horses' hooves and the occasional bird call. Margaret studied Gideon when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the easy way he sat his horse, the alertness with which he scanned the landscape, the competence that seemed to radiate from him. The Vance ranch appeared gradually, first as a windmill on the horizon, then as a collection of buildings that grew clearer as they approached. The main house was a long, low structure made of wood and stone, built to withstand harsh weather. A barn stood nearby, along with several corrals and smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark spots against the pale grass. "It's not fancy," Gideon said, seeming almost apologetic, "but it's home." "It's wonderful," Margaret said honestly. There was something solid and real about the ranch, something that spoke of hard work and perseverance. Gideon showed her into the house, which was sparsely furnished but clean. The main room held a large table, several chairs, and a stone fireplace. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom, and a ladder in the corner climbed to a loft. "My office is here," Gideon said, gesturing to the table, which was covered in papers, receipts, ledgers, and what appeared to be several years' worth of correspondence. "It's a mess, I know that. I'm better with cattle than with paperwork." Margaret surveyed the chaos and felt a challenge rising in her chest. "I've seen worse. Do you have a filing system in mind, or should I create one? Create whatever makes sense to you. As long as I can find things when I need them, I'll be happy." They spent the morning sorting through the papers. Gideon explained his business, the cattle buying and selling, the seasonal patterns, the different buyers he dealt with. Margaret took notes and began creating categories, filing papers into organized stacks. It was satisfying work, bringing order to chaos. Around midday, Gideon went outside to work with the cattle, telling Margaret to continue at her own pace. She became absorbed in the task, hardly noticing the time passing. When Gideon returned in the late afternoon, she'd created a complete filing system and had organized 2 years' worth of receipts chronologically within each category. "I'll need several more days to transfer everything into a proper ledger," she said, showing him what she'd done. "But this should make it easier to find specific transactions when you need them." Gideon studied the organized stacks, then looked at her with something like wonder. "You did all this in one day." "It's what I'm good at," Margaret said simply. "Organization, patterns, systems. It's how my mind works." "Your father is a fool," Gideon said quietly, "sending you out here to prove you can survive hardship when what you should be proving is how valuable your skills are." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." "Call me Gideon. We're going to be working together regularly, might as well be on a first-name basis. Then you should call me Margaret." They rode back to town as the sun set, both tired but satisfied with the day's work. As they approached Williams, Gideon said, "Same time Wednesday." "I'll be ready." Margaret fell into a rhythm over the next 2 weeks. 3 days a week she rode out to Gideon's ranch, where she organized his paperwork and helped him draft letters to potential buyers. The other days she worked at the general store, continuing to improve Thomas's inventory system and bookkeeping. Evenings, she helped Sarah at the boarding house, and on Thursdays attended the quilting circle, where she slowly built friendships with Beth, Caroline, Susan, and several other women. The town's attitude toward her began to shift. The betting pool was still active, but the odds were changing. More people were betting on her lasting at least 3 weeks. A few brave souls even put money on her making it the full month. But it was her relationship with Gideon that underwent the most significant change. What had started as a purely professional arrangement gradually became something more complex. They talked as they worked, sharing stories about their pasts, their dreams, their frustrations. Margaret learned that Gideon had been engaged once, to a girl from Flagstaff, but she'd broken it off when she realized how isolated ranch life would be. She wanted civilization, Gideon said one day as they took a break from work to eat lunch on the porch. Regular shops, neighbors close by, social events. She tried to convince me to sell the ranch and move to Flagstaff, but this land is in my blood. I couldn't leave it any more than I could stop breathing. Did you love her? Margaret asked. I thought I did at the time. Looking back, I think I loved the idea of not being alone more than I loved her specifically. He looked out at the vast landscape. This life isn't for everyone. It takes a certain type of person to thrive out here. Margaret followed his gaze, thinking about how much she'd come to appreciate the stark beauty of the Arizona territory, the endless sky, the sense of space and possibility. I'm beginning to understand why people stay. Gideon looked at her then, really looked at her, and Margaret felt something shift between them. The air seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken tension. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Gideon cleared his throat and stood. We should get back to work. The moment passed, but Margaret couldn't forget the way he'd looked at her, or the way her heart had raced in response. 3 weeks after her arrival in Williams, Margaret received a telegram from her father. It was brief and to the point. Surprised you have lasted this long. Still expect you home by month's end. Richard asks about you. Margaret crumpled the telegram in her fist, anger surging through her. Her father still didn't believe in her, still thought this was all a game she'd eventually lose. And the mention of Richard Hartford was clearly meant to remind her of what awaited her if she failed. She was sitting on the porch of the boarding house, trying to calm her temper when Gideon rode up. It wasn't a scheduled workday, and she looked at him in surprise. Something wrong? She asked. Could ask you the same thing. You look ready to spit fire. Margaret handed him the crumpled telegram. He read it and his jaw tightened. Your father doesn't give up, does he? He's never had to. People always do what he wants eventually. She stood and paced the length of the porch. But I'm not leaving. I don't care what he says or what Richard Hartford wants. I'm staying the full 3 months, and then I'm going back to Boston and telling my father exactly what I think of his manipulations. What if you didn't go back at all? Gideon said quietly. Margaret stopped pacing and looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, what if you stayed here? In Williams. You've got work, you've made friends, and you seem happier than I imagine you were in Boston. He dismounted and came to stand at the base of the porch steps, looking up at her. What if you didn't let your father dictate your life anymore? I've thought about it, Margaret admitted. But I need to face him. Need to prove that I didn't just run away, that I made a deliberate choice and saw it through. Fair enough. But after you've proven your point, consider coming back. Williams could use someone like you. I could use someone like you. There was something in his voice, in his eyes, that made Margaret's breath catch. This wasn't just about bookkeeping or professional respect. This was something deeper, more personal. Gideon, she started, not sure what she was going to say. But before she could continue, Pete Tompkins and 2 of his friends appeared around the corner, clearly drunk despite it being mid-afternoon. Well, Pete slurred. If it ain't the Boston princess and her cowboy. Everybody knows you've been spending time alone with her, Vance. That ain't proper. Go home, Pete, Gideon said, his voice hard. Sleep it off. Or what? You going to fight me over her honor? Pete laughed. She probably don't even have any honor left, spending all that time alone with you. Gideon moved so fast Margaret barely saw it. One moment he was standing at the base of the steps. The next he had Pete by the shirt front, lifting him slightly off his feet. Apologize to the lady, Gideon said quietly, and there was something dangerous in his voice that made Pete's companions take a step back. I didn't mean nothing, Pete stammered, suddenly sober. Just joking around. Apologize. I'm sorry, Miss Louise, I spoke out of turn. Gideon released him and Pete stumbled backward. "If I hear you or anyone else talking about Miss Louise in that manner again, we're going to have a much longer conversation. Understand?" Pete nodded and hurried away, his friends following. Gideon turned back to Margaret, and she saw that his hands were shaking slightly. "I apologize for that," he said. "I shouldn't have lost my temper." "Don't apologize for defending me," Margaret said. She came down the steps and stood close to him, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray-green eyes. "No one has ever done that before. In Boston, men would have laughed along with the crude joke and then told me I was being too sensitive if I objected." "Then Boston men are fools," Gideon said. He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You deserve to be treated with respect, Margaret." She leaned into his touch without thinking, and then his hand was cupping her face and he was leaning down, and she was rising on her toes to meet him. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them testing this new territory. Then Margaret's hands came up to grip his shirt, and Gideon's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. And the kiss deepened into something that made her forget about her father's telegram, about the betting pool, about everything except the feeling of Gideon's lips on hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I've been wanting you to," Margaret whispered back. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other, and Margaret felt something settle in her chest. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just independence or the chance to prove herself, but someone who saw her completely and valued her for exactly who she was. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. Margaret and Gideon were careful to maintain propriety in public, but during their work days at the ranch, they grew closer. They talked about everything, their fears and hopes and dreams. Gideon told her about his childhood, about learning to run cattle from his father, about the loneliness of the past 6 years running the ranch alone. Margaret told him about the suffocating expectations of Boston society, about her desire to do meaningful work instead of being decorative, about her fear that she'd never find someone who understood her. "I understand you," Gideon said one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. "Maybe not everything, not yet, but I want to. I want to know every part of you, Margaret." She kissed him then, and the kiss was interrupted by the first drops of rain. They laughed and ran inside, and Gideon built a fire in the fireplace while Margaret made coffee. It felt domestic and comfortable and right. In town, the betting pool reached its critical point. Margaret had been in Williams for 4 weeks, defying the expectations of nearly everyone. Money changed hands as the pessimistic bets were lost. A few people apologized to her directly, admitting they'd misjudged her. Others simply stopped talking about the pool, embarrassed by their participation. The Quilting Circle women threw a small celebration in Margaret's honor, presenting her with a quilt they'd made together. Each square represented something about Williams, a visual story of the town's history and spirit. "You're one of us now," Beth said, hugging Margaret tight. "You've earned your place here." Margaret held the quilt and felt tears prick her eyes. She'd come to Williams expecting to endure 3 months of hardship as a means to an end. Instead, she'd found a community, a purpose, and a love she'd never anticipated. 5 weeks after her arrival, as Margaret was working in the general store, a well-dressed stranger entered. He looked out of place in his expensive suit and polished shoes, and he looked around the store with obvious disdain. "I'm looking for Margaret Louise," he said to Thomas. "That's me," Margaret said, standing up from behind the counter. Her heart sank as she recognized the man. "Richard Hartford. "Margaret, there you are. I've come to take you home." Richard approached her as if nothing was unusual about his sudden appearance in Arizona. "Your father is worried about you. This bet has gone on long enough." "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret said firmly. "The agreement was 3 months. I still have 7 weeks to go." "Don't be ridiculous. Look at you, you've gone completely native. Your skin is brown, your hands are rough, and you're working in a shop like a common laborer." Richard reached for her arm. "I've convinced your father that we should move up the wedding. We can be married by the end of the month." Margaret pulled her arm away. "I'm not marrying you, Richard. I never agreed to marry you, and I never will. Your father promised you to me. My father doesn't own me. I make my own choices, and I choose to stay here and finish what I started." Richard's face reddened with anger. "You're throwing your life away for what? This dusty town and these ignorant people? You're meant for better things, Margaret." "I've found better things," Margaret said quietly. "I've found work that matters, people who respect me, and a life that's mine. That's more than I ever had in Boston. If this is about that cowboy you've been spending time with, your father told me all about it. He's using you, Margaret. Men like that see women like you as meal tickets. He probably thinks he can marry you and get access to your father's money. Gideon has never asked me for anything except honest work for honest pay, which is more than I can say for you." Richard's expression turned ugly. "Fine. Stay here and ruin yourself, but don't expect to come crawling back when this all falls apart. You'll be damaged goods, unsuitable for any respectable marriage. Then I'll be happily unmarried. Good day, Richard." He left in a huff, slamming the door behind him. Margaret's hands were shaking, but she felt lighter than she had in years. She'd stood up to Richard, to her father's manipulations, to the entire weight of Boston society's expectations, and it felt wonderful. Thomas looked at her with new respect. That took courage. "It took being angry enough to finally speak the truth," Margaret said, but she was smiling. That evening she rode out to Gideon's ranch. It wasn't a scheduled work day, but she needed to see him, to tell him what had happened. She found him in the barn, and the moment he saw her face, he set down the tack he was mending. "What's wrong?" She told him everything about Richard's appearance, his accusations, the threat to cut her off completely from her family. Gideon listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. "He accused you of using me for my father's money," she finished. "As if you even care about any of that." "I don't care about your father's money," Gideon said. "I care about you, just you exactly as you are. I know that. But Richard's appearance complicates things. My father won't let this go. He'll send more people, make more threats. He'll do everything he can to force me back to Boston." "Then stay here," Gideon said. "Not just for 3 months, stay permanently. Marry me." Margaret's breath caught. "What? Marry me?" Gideon repeated. He took her hands in his. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other 5 weeks. But I love you, Margaret. I love your strength and your intelligence and your determination. I love the way you face challenges head on. I love how you've embraced this life even though it's nothing like what you're used to. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to build a life with you, here on this ranch in this town. Say yes." Margaret looked at him, at this man who'd believed in her from the start, who'd given her a chance when everyone else was betting on her failure. She thought about the life he was offering, the freedom and partnership and love. She thought about Boston, about her father's mansion and Richard Hartford's cold ambition. There was no comparison. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Gideon swept her into his arms and kissed her, and Margaret felt like she was flying. This was right. This was what she'd been searching for all along without knowing it. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Williams. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, and Reverend Matthews beamed as he pronounced them husband and wife. Sarah Chen cried. Beth, Caroline, and Susan served as Margaret's attendants. Thomas Brennan gave her away, gruffly emotional about the whole affair. The betting pool was officially closed, with a handful of people who'd bet on Margaret staying the full 3 months winning a substantial sum. But they all agreed to donate the winnings to the church and the school, feeling it was only right. Margaret sent a telegram to her father the day after the wedding. I have stayed the 3 months as agreed. I have married a good man and will be making my life in Williams, Arizona. I no longer require or desire your financial support. You underestimated me, Father. I hope someday you'll regret that. Your daughter, Margaret Vance. His response came 3 days later. You are no longer my daughter. Do not contact me again. Margaret read the telegram and felt sadness, but also relief. She'd cut the strings that had bound her to a life she never wanted. She was free. Life on the ranch was harder than anything Margaret had experienced in Boston. She learned to cook over a wood stove, to tend chickens and collect eggs, to help with the cattle during branding season. Her hands grew rough and calloused. Her skin darkened further under the relentless sun. Her muscles grew strong from physical labor, but she was happy. Deeply, genuinely happy in a way she'd never been before. Gideon was a patient teacher and a loving husband. He never expected her to simply know how to do ranch work, but neither did he coddle her. They worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset, talking about their day, making plans for the future. Margaret continued to do bookkeeping for Thomas at the general store 1 day a week, and she took on similar work for several other businesses in Williams. She discovered she had a talent for helping people organize their finances and business practices, and within a few months, she was earning a respectable income from her consulting work. Gideon's business flourished under her management. She helped him expand his buyer network, negotiated better prices, and implemented systems that made the ranch run more efficiently. By the end of their first year of marriage, the ranch's income had doubled. But more than the financial success, it was the life they built together that mattered. They made the ranch house into a home, adding furniture and decorations that reflected both their personalities. Margaret planted a garden and took pride in growing vegetables in the harsh climate. Gideon expanded the herd and hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased work. About 18 months after their wedding, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Gideon one evening as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset. "I have news," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Gideon's face transformed with joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her gently as if she might break. "A baby. We're going to have a baby." Their son was born in the spring of 1885, delivered by Sarah Chen, who'd served as midwife for most of Williams. They named him Grant Thomas Vance, after no one in particular, simply because they liked the name. Grant had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's determination, making his presence known from his first lusty cry. Gideon was a devoted father, carrying Grant around the ranch from the time he could hold his head up, teaching him about the land and the cattle. Margaret would watch them together and feel her heart swell with love. 2 years later, their daughter arrived, a tiny thing with dark hair and a quiet demeanor that contrasted sharply with her boisterous older brother. They named her Rose Eleanor Vance, and she quickly became the apple of her father's eye. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered. The children grew. Margaret's consulting business expanded to include several ranches and businesses throughout the territory. She became known as one of the sharpest business minds in northern Arizona, and no one ever questioned her capability, or right to work. 5 years after leaving Boston, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It was from her mother, whom she'd had no contact with since her father's disowning telegram. The letter was tentative and apologetic, explaining that her mother had been trying to reach out for years, but her father had forbidden it. Now, her father had died suddenly of a heart attack, and her mother wanted to reconnect. Margaret read the letter several times, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Anger at her father for his stubbornness and cruelty. Sadness that he died without them reconciling. Relief that the door was open to rebuild a relationship with her mother. She showed the letter to Gideon, who read it carefully. "What do you want to do?" "I want to write back," Margaret said. "I want my mother to know her grandchildren. I'm not ready to forgive my father, even in death, but I'm willing to have a relationship with her if she genuinely wants one." "Then that's what we'll do." Margaret wrote back, a long letter describing her life in Williams, her marriage, her children, her business. She included photographs of Grant and Rose, of the ranch, of her and Gideon. She was honest about her feelings regarding her father, but she was also open to moving forward with her mother. Her mother's response was tearful and grateful. Over the following years, they rebuilt their relationship through letters. Margaret's mother came to visit twice, marveling at the life her daughter had built, delighting in her grandchildren, and admitting that Margaret had been right to follow her own path. "Your father never understood," her mother said during her second visit, as they sat on the porch watching Grant and Rose play in the yard. "He thought providing money and social position was enough. He didn't understand that you needed freedom and purpose. Did you understand?" Margaret asked gently. "Not at first, but I do now. You're happy here, truly happy. That's all a mother really wants for her child." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Grant grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved the ranch and showed every sign of following in his father's footsteps. Rose was quieter but fiercely intelligent, showing an aptitude for numbers that reminded Margaret of herself. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gideon took Margaret back to the spot where they'd first kissed, now a special place they visited on important occasions. "You ever regret it?" he asked, holding both her hands. "Giving up Boston, your father's money, the easy life you could have had?" Margaret laughed. "Easy? That life was never easy. It was suffocating and restrictive and soul-crushing. This life is hard work, but it's mine. I chose it, I built it, and I love every challenging, exhausting, wonderful moment of it. Even the moments when the well runs dry, or the cattle get sick, or Grant breaks his arm falling off a fence, especially those moments, because we face them together, and we solve them together, and we become stronger together." She kissed him softly. "I love you, Gideon Vance. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else was blind, for believing in me when everyone else was betting against me, and for giving me a life worth living." "I should be thanking you," Gideon said. "You took a lonely cowboy and gave him a family, a partner, and a reason to wake up smiling every morning." They stood together as the sun set over the Arizona landscape, two people who defied expectations and built something beautiful from determination, trust, and love. When Grant turned 15 and Rose 13, a representative from the railroad came to Williams with an interesting proposition. The railroad was expanding through northern Arizona and wanted to purchase right-of-way through several properties, including the Vance ranch. The offer was substantial, enough that they could sell the ranch entirely and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. The family discussed it over several long evenings. Grant was adamantly against selling, passionate about keeping the ranch in the family. Rose was more pragmatic, pointing out that the money could be used for education and opportunities they might not otherwise have. In the end, They compromised. They sold the right-of-way but kept the ranch, using the railroad money to improve their property, purchase more land, and set up trust funds for the children's futures. It was Margaret who negotiated the deal, impressing the railroad representatives with her business acumen and securing terms far more favorable than their initial offer. "Your wife is formidable," the lead representative told Gideon after the deal was finalized. "You're a lucky man." "Don't I know it?" Gideon replied, looking at Margaret with open adoration. As their children grew into adults, both choosing to stay in Arizona rather than seeking opportunities back east, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. She thought about that young woman who'd stepped off the stage in Williams 17 years ago, determined to prove herself capable, but having no idea what she was really getting into. That woman had been brave but naive, strong but untested. The woman she'd become had been forged by hard work, challenged by harsh conditions, and strengthened by love. She'd found her place in the world not by following the path laid out for her, but by blazing her own trail through territory that terrified her. The town of Williams had changed too. It was larger now, more prosperous, connected to the wider world by the railroad. But it maintained its character, its sense of community, its appreciation for people who proved their worth through action rather than words. Margaret never forgot the betting pool that had welcomed her to Williams, that collective assumption that she'd fail. In a strange way, she was grateful for it. It had shown her what she was capable of overcoming, had introduced her to Gideon, and had proven that people's expectations meant nothing compared to personal determination. On their 20th anniversary, Margaret and Gideon hosted a large celebration at the ranch. The entire town came, along with Margaret's mother, who'd become a regular visitor. Sarah Chen, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, sat in a place of honor. During the celebration, Pete Tompkins, now sober and reformed after a near-death experience 5 years prior, approached Margaret. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one, not the one Gideon forced out of me all those years ago. I was cruel to you when you first came to town. I bet against you, I mocked you, and I tried to make your life difficult. You proved me wrong in every possible way, and I'm sorry for how I treated you." Margaret looked at the man who'd once been her biggest critic and saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "I forgive you, Pete. We were all different people back then." "You were always the same person," Pete said. "Strong and determined. The rest of us were just too blind to see it." As the sun set on their celebration, Margaret stood with Gideon, watching their children and grandchildren. Yes, Grant had married young and already had 2 babies, enjoying the party. "We did good," Gideon said, his arm around her waist. "We did," Margaret agreed. "We built something real and lasting. We raised good children. We made a difference in this town, not bad for a Boston lady who wasn't supposed to last a week." Gideon laughed and pulled her close. "Best bet I never made. I never put money in that pool, you know. I couldn't bring myself to bet on something as important as your success or failure. It felt wrong." "What did you think would happen?" Honestly, I didn't know. I hoped you'd stay. From the moment I saw you dragging that trunk through the dust, refusing help, determined to do it yourself, I hoped you'd stay. And then I got to know you, and hoping turned into wanting, and wanting turned into needing. I needed you to stay because I was falling in love with you and couldn't imagine my life without you in it." Margaret turned in his arms and kissed him, still feeling the same spark she'd felt at their first kiss 2 decades ago. "I love you, Gideon Vance. Thank you for making sure I never wanted to go." "I didn't make sure of anything," Gideon said. "You chose to stay because you're stubborn and brilliant and too determined to let anyone tell you what you can't do. I just gave you a reason to want to." They stood together as the stars emerged in the vast Arizona sky. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and built a love story that defied every expectation. The town had bet she'd leave within a month, but the cowboy had seen something in her that no one else had, something worth believing in, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. And in the end, that belief had made all the difference. 25 years after Margaret first arrived in Williams, she sat on the porch of the ranch house, now expanded and improved but still fundamentally the same place she'd fallen in love with. Gideon sat beside her, his hair graying at the temples but his eyes still that remarkable gray-green that had captured her heart so long ago. Grant ran the ranch now, having taken over gradually as Gideon stepped back from the daily operations. He did it with skill and wisdom, having learned from both his parents the value of hard work, smart business practices, and treating people fairly. His wife, Anna, was a teacher in Williams, and their 3 children were the light of Margaret and Gideon's lives. Rose had surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer, one of the first women to practice law in Arizona territory. She'd studied through correspondence courses and apprenticeships, driven by the same determination that had brought her mother to Williams in the first place. She specialized in property rights and business law, and she was making a name for herself throughout the territory. "We should write our story down," Margaret said suddenly, "for the grandchildren, so they know where they came from, what we overcame to build this life." "You think they'd be interested?" Gideon asked. "I think they need to know that anything is possible if you're willing to work for it, if you're willing to defy expectations and forge your own path." She took his hand. "I think they need to know that love can happen in the most unexpected places between the most unlikely people, and that it can sustain you through decades of challenges and joys." "Then we'll write it," Gideon agreed. "We'll tell them about the betting pool and the Boston lady who refused to fail and the cowboy who fell in love with her determination." Margaret laughed. "Is that how you remember it? You fell in love with my determination. I fell in love with everything about you. The determination just caught my attention first." They sat together as the sun set, 2 people who'd spent a quarter-century building a life together, and Margaret thought about how strange and wonderful life's journey could be. She'd come to Williams expecting to endure 3 months of hardship to win her freedom from her father's control. Instead, she'd found a home, a purpose, a community, and a love deeper than anything she'd imagined possible. The town had bet she'd leave within a month. The cowboy had made sure she never wanted to go. But in truth, she'd made that choice herself, following her heart instead of the path others laid out for her, and it had been the best choice of her life. Years continued to unfold like pages in a beloved book. Margaret and Gideon grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They watched their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren arrive. They celebrated births and mourned deaths, weathered droughts and rejoiced in good years, always together, always partners. Margaret's mother lived to see her 92nd birthday, spending her final years in a small house in Williams, close to the daughter and family she'd nearly lost. She passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the people she loved, grateful for the second chance at family that Margaret had given her. Sarah Chen lived to 103, finally passing away in her sleep after a life well lived. The entire town mourned her, and Margaret gave a eulogy that had everyone in tears, talking about how Sarah had been the first person to see potential in a scared Boston lady and give her a chance. The ranch prospered under Grant's management, expanding and modernizing while still maintaining the values Gideon had instilled. Rose's legal practice grew, and she became an advocate for women's rights and property ownership. using her sharp mind and her mother's business acumen to make real change in the territory. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Margaret and Gideon renewed their vows in the same church where they'd first married. The building had been renovated over the years, but the cross on the wall was the same. Reverend Matthews had long since passed, but his successor performed the ceremony with the same warmth and sincerity. Margaret was 67 years old, her hair silver, her face lined with the marks of a life lived fully in the Arizona sun. Gideon was 70, his body bearing the wear of decades of ranch work but his spirit as strong as ever. "I, Margaret, take you, Gideon, to be my husband again," Margaret said, her voice clear and strong. "I promised you 40 years ago that I would love you, honor you, and build a life with you. I've kept that promise, and I make it again today. You are my partner, my love, my home, today and always." "I, Gideon, take you, Margaret, to be my wife again," Gideon said, his voice rough with emotion. 40 years ago I promised to love you, to support you, to believe in you always. That was the easiest promise I ever made and the greatest privilege of my life to keep. You are my heart, my strength, my reason, today and always." As they kissed, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren crowded around, along with what seemed like the entire town of Williams. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, which now sprawled over 3 times the acreage Gideon had started with. Food and music filled the evening air. Stories were told, old friendships celebrated, and new memories made. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that only the Arizona desert could produce, Margaret and Gideon slipped away from the party to their favorite spot on the porch. "Do you remember the first time you brought me here?" Margaret asked, leaning into Gideon's shoulder. "I was so nervous. I had no idea what I was doing, pretending I could work on a ranch." "You figured it out," Gideon said. "You always figure things out." "We figured it out together," Margaret corrected. "That's what makes it work. We've always been partners from the very beginning." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the party continuing behind them, the laughter of their family mixing with music and celebration. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I needed to be seen. For believing in me when everyone else was betting I'd fail. For loving me not despite my stubborn determination but because of it. For giving me a life worth living." Gideon kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing this life, this place, me. Thank you for 40 years of partnership, love, and adventure. Thank you for our children and grandchildren and this beautiful life we've built together." "I'd choose you again," Margaret said. "Every time in every life I'd choose you. And I'd make sure you never wanted to go," Gideon replied. "Every time in every life." They sat together as the stars emerged, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the birth of their children, and every important moment of their life together. The town that had once bet on Margaret's failure had become their home, filled with people who loved and respected them both. Margaret thought about the young woman she'd been, stepping off that stage with determination and fear in equal measure. She thought about all the challenges overcome, the lessons learned, the love discovered. She thought about the life she'd almost lived, trapped in Boston society, married to a man who saw her as property, never knowing her own strength or capability. And she thought about the life she'd actually lived, the one she'd fought for and built with her own 2 hands alongside the man she loved. It hadn't been easy. There had been years when they'd struggled financially, when the cattle died or the rains didn't come. There had been losses and grief and moments when the future seemed uncertain. But through it all, they'd had each other. They'd faced every challenge as partners, celebrated every victory together, and built something that would outlast them both. As the night deepened and the party gradually wound down, their family came to find them. Grant and Rose, now middle-aged with children of their own. The grandchildren, some with families of their own now. The great-grandchildren, the youngest barely walking. They gathered around Margaret and Gideon, 4 generations of Vances, living proof of what could be built from love, determination, and unwavering partnership. "Tell us the story," Grant's oldest daughter said. She was 16, the same age Margaret had been when she'd first started questioning the path her father had laid out for her. "Tell us how you and Grandpa met." Margaret looked at Gideon, and he nodded with a smile. So she told them the story she'd told many times before but never tired of sharing. She told them about the stagecoach and the dust and the betting pool. She told them about the general store and the boarding house and Sarah Chen's quiet support. She told them about the cowboy who'd offered her work and respect when everyone else offered only skepticism and mockery. She told them about falling in love with a man who saw her potential before she fully understood it herself. About the choice to stay not just for 3 months, but forever. About building a life and a family from determination, hard work, and love that deepened with every passing year. As she spoke, she watched their faces, seeing their amazement and inspiration. These children and grandchildren had never known anything but opportunity and support. They'd grown up in a family where intelligence was celebrated, where women could be lawyers and business people, where hard work was valued above social position. But they needed to know that it hadn't always been this way. They needed to understand that the opportunities they took for granted had been fought for and won by people who refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on them. "The town bet I'd leave within a month," Margaret finished. "They thought I was too soft, too privileged, too unprepared for real life. And maybe I was all those things when I arrived. But your grandfather saw something else. He saw potential and determination and stubbornness that wouldn't quit. He gave me a chance to prove myself, and then he fell in love with me for exactly who I was. And I've never regretted it for a single moment," Gideon added, squeezing her hand. "Best decision I ever made was offering her work at the ranch. Second best decision was proposing marriage. Your grandmother changed my life, changed this ranch, changed this whole town really. And now we're all here because of it," Rose said, looking around at her extended family. "Because Mama refused to accept what others said she could or couldn't do. Because she chose love and partnership over comfort and social expectations. That's a legacy worth remembering." The family talked into the night, sharing stories and memories, weaving together the tapestry of their shared history. And at the center of it all sat Margaret and Gideon, the couple who defied expectations and built something lasting from courage, love, and stubborn determination. When the last guest finally left and the house grew quiet, Margaret and Gideon made their way to bed, tired but happy. As they lay together in the darkness, Gideon pulled Margaret close. "No regrets?" he asked, as he had so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Margaret replied, as she always did. "This life, this love, this family, it's everything I never knew I wanted and exactly what I needed. The town bet I'd leave within a month, but you made sure I never wanted to go." "We made sure," Gideon corrected gently. "Together, always together. And that was the truth of it. Not that a cowboy had somehow trapped or convinced a city woman to stay, but that 2 people had found each other at the right time in the right place, and had chosen to build something beautiful together. They'd faced challenges and celebrated victories as partners, each making the other stronger, better, more complete. Margaret fell asleep in Gideon's arms as she had for 40 years, grateful for every moment of the life they'd shared. The town had bet on her failure, but she and Gideon had proven that love, determination, and partnership could overcome any obstacle, defy any expectation, and build something that would last generations. It was the love story neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. And it had made all the difference.